The short reading here is an invitation not to fall into this hardness of heart, which is the language used by the Old Testament, an uncircumcised heart. Here he says, "Each day I stretched out my hand toward rebellious people that went by evil ways, following their own whims, a people who provoked me to my face incessantly." It corresponds, unfortunately, to the state that we can be in before our God. I was just reading quietly before the sacrament this morning some thoughts of the Holy Father on the matter. He has given in this Evangelii Gaudium a whole teaching on the importance of dialogue and hence listening in the liturgical context. That there is a conversation and an encounter going on several levels when we are in the house of God. And the word is capital. The word must be heard, the word must be vibrant, the word must speak, and for that to happen there has to be a perception of the receptivity, the nature of the soul. That is to say that it's not enough to utter. As when we are in true communion with a person, we are listening on several levels, so too when it comes to dialoguing in the name of God, there has to be this perception of what's going on out there in these people in front of one. If that's not happening, there is no deep penetration. It's not enough to read the text. If one notices the way that the Holy Father himself gives the model, even on a daily basis now, and it can be seen on the internet if one wants to, he is truly dialoguing with his people. It is not just intellectual input. Any one of you who are involved with catechetics or teaching, or who are school teachers, or even parents will know that a word only has an effect if there is life in it. Now, that applies to this context, but to every context in life. Because unfortunately, if we go through life not knowing that, we can actually be heavyweights. Words coming out of us which are heavy. We are talking at someone. And that's happening more than one thing. Observe any dysfunctional conversation, and it's pretty well that that's going on. It can happen on every level of life, actually, even a board meeting. If one observes human dynamics, if there is no reception, if each one is coming with his baggage to give to the other, it remains there. It happens too in any conversation. A conversation is done with the ear. I've been taught that actually in chant, in monastic life in France. Le chant se fait avec l'oreille. Chant is done with the ear. So too conversation is done avec l'oreille. And if we're not good listeners, we're not good communicants on the level of the soul. And listening, of course, happens not just with the ear, it happens on the perception of all the elements of language and communication. Much of our emission is bodily. Of course, that depends on the culture. One extreme would be, I suppose, the English context, when people do not use the body much. And going, because I was a student in Wales, my best friend was a student in Oxford, and I used to go and visit him, and I noticed there when you went into that mode, into one of the Oxford colleges to eat, then you got into their mode, and whereas in Wales, speaking Welsh and so on, there would be a lot of very Italianate expansion going on. There it was quite different. You dared not even laugh. At the most, you might have a twinkle in your eye to make someone else laugh, just with the power of the word, just the context there of the culture. But you go to another culture and it's quite different, and the body enters far more into it. I was actually quite amused almost just last week when I was helping out in Italy to see how the priest was giving on the phone directions how to get to him. And on the phone, it was all happening. On the phone, as though giving directions with the hand was essential on the phone to showing how to get to somewhere. So somewhere in between, I suppose, is the norm in Ireland. But one does observe, e.g. in facial expressions, a lot of communication going on. There is an awful lot of truth said in the mouth. The power to bring down a tense situation by the suggestion of a smile or by a little saving witticism is huge. Otherwise, one gets into head-on collision. One can avoid that, but it's not worth going through life from one collision to the next. It's a secret I'm giving you. Don't go into collisions. Avoid them. And if there's a collision ahead of you, make a detour. You don't have to get involved with every cosmic explosion or treat every issue. Calculate, is it worth the risk of losing peace or not? Usually it's not. On the other hand, if one comes into the soul of a person who genuinely has this desire to know more, that's quite different. Now, the Holy Father goes into this context of what's going on in this element of communication in the liturgical sphere. The word has to be heard, hence it has to be well read. And any of you who are involved in that ministry ought to think about that, because quite often a priest will come to the homily part and he can't actually preach on the readings because they've not been understood. It's not just something one offers to anyone just like that, a few minutes before the celebration. Would you like to do the reading? A reading has to be prepared out of respect for the Word of God. And it's not enough to read the words. One has to also make as much attention to the punctuation as to the words. A pause is a part of the reading. The truth is heard in its echo, and if there's no echo, there's no time for it to settle. One can go into many a celebration on the liturgical level, and what has one? An unstoppable flow of undigested words. No peace, all intellectual, thump, thump, thump. That's not helpful to a dialogue. One is not just a brain. One is in need of an atmosphere which carries and suggests, heals and soothes, in which the words then, fewer in number, can settle and penetrate and have that effect. As in a conversation, somebody who can't stop talking, especially quickly, is, as I say, a heavyweight. Don't be one yourself. Be interesting. Know how to listen when you've said enough and people would want you to let them have a chance or just be quiet. Now, in, therefore, the proclamation of the Word, it enters into mode that things should also be in the spirit in which they were written. A psalm is not a reading. A psalm, by the very meaning of the word, is to be sung on the psalterium, one of these 10-chorded small harps. And the notion of singing a psalm was quite alien to those who were composing them and to the Lord himself. Notice that the Lord is reported to have sung. When? Precisely in the liturgical context. The model was given at the first celebration of the Last Supper. They sang a hymn. Having sung a hymn, they went to the Garden of Olives. Actually, that would have been probably the psalms which form part of the Hallel. There would have been praise psalms sung at the Passover meal, and that would have been the hymnology. I'm sure it's a very beautiful celebration. If you hear these Jews singing, they can sing quite well. It's rather similar in some mode to the Byzantine. Now, by the way, a small bracket, do you know that one of their tones has come through the centuries in Christian worship? It's the Tonus Peregrinus. It's sung classically at the second psalm of Vespers. In exito Israel de Egypto, pausam de vapolo barbaro. We have that in common with the Jews. was right back, showing, by the way, how we have common roots with where we're coming from. We did not come from the moon, we took on a lot of what was there. And these psalms were prayed by the Lord, and therefore we are using what is sacred twice over. And we share it with our huge, wider family of those in prayer using these ancient words. So therefore, by its nature, there should be a pause there. If there is just a wordiness with no modality of song, other dimensionality, it is extremely linear. This element of just a little bit of effort makes a huge difference, and it's not that difficult. So things like the psalm and the acclamation of the gospel, by nature, demand singing. And last week I noticed how in Italy, even at the crack of dawn, it was all happening. They were filling the church at the crack of dawn with beautiful, beautiful harmonic singing. Nuns and so on. It was just not difficult to do, but they enjoyed being there. Why should we not enjoy and be healed by our praise? It's also the best advertisement we can do for the gospel, you know, just as it's a bad advertisement to have bad liturgy. Do you know, one time there was a suicide in France, a few years ago now. This was reported to the bishops in conference at Lauds, the Episcopal Conference of France. A quote, somebody who just committed suicide left this suicide message. He addressed one paragraph to Christians. À vous les chrétiens, je dis, to you Christians I say, j'ai été enchanté par la beauté de vos évangiles. I was enchanted by the beauty of your gospels, mais j'ai été effrayé par la laideur de vos assemblées. But I was frightened by the ugliness of your assemblies. And off he went with his soul. And there was a tremble in the Episcopal aula. They realized that's a message for us. And in France, they made a big, big, big effort that every celebration is, as far as possible, sung on a Sunday. There are fewer of them, therefore the quality is higher. And you have no notion of this minimal, quickie thing. If you go to a celebration in France or Germany or Switzerland, you'll find it lasts an hour. The celebration is cared for with singing, and the homily is prepared well and will last about a quarter of an hour. So it's not always in the interests even of the people to have the minimum. Why? They get used to not being fed. You can't do an awful lot in 30 minutes. You can't develop a theme. You can't give an experience of something beyond the daily. You give them more of what they know already, and they're not elevated. That's impoverishing. And it could be our case too. So it matters, in the measure in which it's possible, to expose ourselves to something which heals and elevates. And sometimes we can act upon it. If one has talent, one can use them and find a priest who will accept their use. A lot, unfortunately, depends on the readiness of those in control to be open. Yes, to making it slightly more of an effort, therefore perhaps longer. But if those who are bored make a noise, well, why should they be the ones that influence it for everyone else? And that's what's happening, you know. Unfortunately, it's the lowest common denominator. We pander to those who don't want to be there. So that's a cyclical, vicious circle, ever perpetuating itself. Alas, we're stuck. No one dares rock the boat. And it's a sad situation. It's everywhere, I'm afraid. Very few exceptions. Now, with regard to, then, the way in which he insists that there is a danger, however, on the other side, that, for instance, the homily can be too human-centered and can be rendering the Lord in some way in the form of eclipse, because if it goes on longer than the actual Eucharistic part of the celebration itself, then the Lord is being put aside and man is taking over. There has to be a harmony and balance. Now, Pope Benedict has quite a lot of profound thought on the way in which there is a double orientation. Before he was Pope, he was already involved in the discussion. And he was writing in this vein that there is a double dynamic in the celebration. a double orientation. The first is what I'm talking about, this actual dialogue. Therefore, it presumes this kind of situation now, where face to face one looks at the people and they look at you. There is dialogue. The second is quite different. And to use that mode there does not follow. Hence it is that historically, from the offertory onwards, even physically the orientation is different. The priest as a man does not get into it. It's all to do with the verticality, and therefore that is better expressed in the physical orientation of all in one direction, including the priest, orientated towards heaven. Therefore, to use that element of dialogue, even in the second part, e.g., in pandering to the people, in making remarks, in even making them clap and laugh, is a desecration of the verticality, and it's an enthroning of man. And that's happening more than we think. People, e.g., trying to be interesting at the altar by innovating, doing things which draw attention to themselves, and not realizing that true liturgy is a service, an obedient, humble invisibility to divine majesty, which is enthroned. And for that to happen, obedience physically enters into it, because there's no worship in disobedience to the one that we're worshipping. As in marriage, there is no true love when we actually deliberately go against the will perceived of the beloved. It's to do with the will. We can't just be interesting and displease. So, to get back to what I was saying, there is this element then in which the Lord, in a context of elevation, himself is able to dialogue with the soul. Because in that second part, if it is truly contemplative, as it has to be by nature, and the priest, by the way, is also bound to be, by his very orientation, a contemplative. He cannot just be an active. He is configured to Christ the High Priest, and one cannot separate without intimacy. If one is a machine, and that is partly why things go wrong. If that relationship is not there, there's bound to be a bad application. Hence, that's the true problem we're faced with in our time. One has no use going into the symptoms without realizing the illness. What happened in the period of application of Vatican II and up to our day, it's still happening, is the problem was at that level. Potentially there was a bomb in our hands for things to be a hugely renewing experience of the church. But it presumed what? Mature, loving, obedient human beings. That was the bit that wasn't there at the crucial time quite often. People who were wanting to be spectacular, people who were wanting to in some way be different from the others, and then that caught on. So disobedience became the norm. And so bit by bit, the possibility for a genuinely interiorized liturgy became, yes, let's say it, a performance, a show. And there's a lot of that going on parish level. And the proof is when applause comes in. It's the complete desecration of the worship of God. Man is being praised and not God, and against his will. So just to get this straight, there's a profound problem of people looking in the wrong area for it. You, for instance, in a monastery or a genuinely authentic convent where people are into prayer, naturally things will happen well because the bottom line is right. Because it's coming as an expression of something there. If that thing is not there, of course, all the rest will follow. So that's the level. Get to that level and the rest will follow. And by the way, that also has its repercussions on every level. If that's not there, people will not, e.g., behave well before and after. Hence it is that the church itself is no longer what it should be. And by the way, with that, I've got these here, and I've got a few copied there, but if you want to take them, one for yourself, I wouldn't mind, because they're actually quite good. And it's this little angel peeping out of the tabernacle and asking that there be no talking when the Lord of Glory is there. And it is something which goes back to, in that quote at the beginning, what was asked of Jacinta before she died, the little one of Fatima. She was in hospital dying, and she wanted this message known, that heaven, our Blessed Lady, was not pleased with talking in church. And it wasn't as bad then as it is now. And it wasn't being listened to, and so she insisted, but the message is there. So she knew, and obviously she was being told that in some way, she was being given that to understand by heaven itself before she died. She was very pure, and she was a little angel, so she knows what she's talking about. And if we're into that, we're also hurting the Lord ourselves, because we're supposed to be his friends, and he's hurt more by his friends than by those who don't care for him. So be careful of that one. Because out of a forced charity, we start to engage in conversation, do we not, if we're honest? Well, the secret is this. As it was in the monastic life, you do not engage your vocal cords in a regular place. The cloister, the refectory, the church, the regular places, library. You do not engage the vocal cords. That's the secret. You can whisper, but you don't have to engage the vocal cords. And then you get the message over and done with. That's it. Engaging the vocal cords is actually infringing someone else's sacred space, because they hear you. That's where, of course, the Trappist language comes out. It's just so as not to damage the silence of other people, because silence is a delicate member and easily aggressed. So, with regard to this then, just be aware that every time we're exposed to a liturgical atmosphere, we are coming into a part of the earth which does not belong to earth. And therefore we enter into a different mode. It's extraterritorial. And if one goes to an Eastern celebration, one is exposed to that, in a sense, more. Why? There is a totality of ethos which elevates. One is immediately struck by the density of otherness, incense and unceasing chant, going on and on and on. And the other one is time. They are not aware of time. I remember when I was in Bethlehem just a few months ago there, I noticed that when it came to, they have to maintain the status quo, that's what it's called, because they share some of these places, Bethlehem and the Holy Sepulchre. It's very delicate, but they do it by maintaining what has always worked. So what works on a Thursday in Bethlehem is this. It's the one day in the week when the Latins, as ourselves, have use of the Holy Grotto for the full Latin Mass, completely silent incense. It's always happened, and still goes on. And, of course, the Greeks have that same grotto, but they have a different order, but it's there. We have the order of the manger, they have the order of the actual nativity. It's a tiny grotto, but you see, how do you do it? Because the Greeks, they go on and on, and we know where we're going, kind of thing. It's different, it's more chiseled. So it's in the rubrics, it has to go. When the Mass of the Greeks is over, the Latins start. So it's flexible, and it works within a quarter of an hour, but it's peaceful. But you see, the point is this, you can't change the East. So if you want to see what liturgy is in a sense, what our roots are, because we had it too in some way, look at what has not changed. It'll just be a shock that we've got it down to a very, very stark minimum. We've robbed ourselves of experience, we've robbed our God of glory. It's rather sad. And who's gaining? So, true understanding of Vatican II would be true understanding of what the Spirit was trying to say to the churches. He was trying to say this. It's too wordy, too heavy, too loaded and complicated, because it's rather like a cathedral now covered in statues. You can't see the great linear movements, the architecture, the plan. You know what happened? With the centuries, there had been different families that liturgy developed. At Trent, it was fixed. Thus it will be. But they had such respect for all they were receiving that they didn't take away, they juxtaposed. So what we have in the Missal of 1570 is roughly 3 masses put together. I'm simplifying, but it gives you an idea. So we have that triplication of things right through it. You see what went wrong? And that carried on more as time went on. So halt! that's what the Spirit was saying to the church in Vatican II. Let's get the architecture right. And Paul VI, very soon after the Vatican Council, it was towards the beginning of the 70s, he made this startling remark. Listen to this. There is no need for identifying the new form of the liturgy with desacralization. He had seen that what had happened was this. The bomb, the power, had been hijacked. He himself, and he comments on this, had hoped, they all had hoped, that it would heal this element of saying prayers quickly without meaning them, which was the illness everywhere because of this. He said, this has happened, there has been that, but, and he went on, but he did not see any reason why that other thing should have come in, because the present liturgy, understood, interiorized, is actually more contemplative. Why? It's more aerated and properly done, more peaceful, because the priest and people can take it in. There's no need that this other stuff should be the norm henceforth. And that can happen. You know, one of the problems, the lay people accept everything. Do not say a thing. Father says so, so it must be right. Well, no. And you know that Benedict XVI has asked, not that long before he abdicated, it was a very important document. No, it was already in 2005 or so, that's right. He gave this document and inviting that there should be, henceforth, a redressing of these things, because he was insisting that nothing could be done until the congregation was informed. That is, he was inviting that people should inform the congregation for the discipline of the sacraments and divine worship day in Rome when things were gravely abusive and nothing was done. The correct thing is to report immediately the priest, and then if nothing happens, the bishop, and then if nothing happens, one can go higher. E.g., if a priest refuses the Holy Communion because you want it on the mouth or kneeling, that, if it's not addressed by the bishop, and he would have said so, should go to Rome, and they'll come down like a ton of bricks, I assure you. But get back to the bishop, why it's not being corrected. You have your rights, and this is happening. Lay people do not know their rights. And it's because all this has been going on for years that no one is actually stopping them, and it's become a norm. And all the abuses, e.g. when one finds strange things going on, like people being invited to receive Holy Communion by dipping themselves, host in a chalice, that kind of nonsense. It's all stuff coming in because no one stops it, often from the pews. Now, if you're hearing these things from the Holy Spirit, they might be put there precisely because he wants you to do something about it. You have your rights and you can act. You do not get involved in the debate. You can address the priest. If he doesn't listen, then you go higher, and you go higher still, because you have your rights. And I assure you, you will have more effect than you know. I just conclude with this. A case happened to me not that long ago. It was a lady, a young lady actually, who was troubled by two issues. One was the fact that her children knew that only a priest could bless. And they were going up to get a blessing from the priest. And it was waylaid, intercepted by an extraordinary minister, a lady who came and presumed to bless them. And they went to Mammy afterwards puzzled and upset. And then she wrote to me. And the other, same lady, was upset by something else that was going on, that lay people were trundling up to the tabernacle and themselves taking the ciboria from there. And she again thought that doesn't seem right. And so these two questions came to me, and I wrote back to her immediately saying, well, look, the best thing to do is just ask what you've asked me to the congregation itself. So she did. So, and they will answer these letters if they're polite, as it was. And the letter came back very quickly from the congregation in Rome, Congregation for the Discipline of the Sacraments, Congregation for Divine Worship. And it went in this vein. With regard to going to the tabernacle, only a priest or a deacon may do that. That was quite clear. The reason, of course, is that the custody of the Blessed Sacrament is in the hands of the Church, and to appropriate is to misunderstand the nature of the gift. One receives, and one has to be seen to be receiving. All the giving of the body of Christ is coming from the Church, and to appropriate it, e.g., during the celebration of the Eucharist, one sees sometimes a layperson might go in to help out and go straight to the tabernacle without being given the support. See, that's a misunderstanding of the nature of the gift. One can't snatch God. It doesn't work like that. And any use of extraordinary ministers, which by the way is questionable anyway when there aren't sufficient numbers, is something which has to be properly catechized, because people are not being formed now. There's no course quite often going on before they're given these ministries. But anyway, the other one was the question of blessing. And it went into it in some detail in this vein. It has always been perceived that there is a special force in the blessing of the priest. Of course, that's theological. It is not the priest who's blessing, but Christ is blessing in him. And Our Lady is supposed to have said that in Medjugorje, if you only know the power of the priest's blessing. And I think she also said that she can't have it in the same way. That's interesting. In other words, the priest it's that of her own son, the consecrated hands of the priests. And by the way, they have also power of healing quite often, because that's not exploited. It's there, it's bound to be there, because Christ himself was healing, was blessing. And but then it went on in this vein, that actually the whole question of should that be happening or not was not clarified, because although John Paul II had the habit quite often of blessing those who were Baptists, e.g. Protestants might come, outwardly he would bless them, it was not actually in the missal itself, so the question was left open. And it did go in this vein that, although not saying it, there could be no blessing as such in the question of a layperson. It didn't say this, but what's going on there is that it's some kind of way of saying we're praying for you or we're welcoming you, but there's actually no confirming blessing going on there. So the children are actually being deprived if they're doing that regularly. They're not having the blessing they have a right to from the priest. The priest, actually, I know, does this on a Sunday. Children, he wants to come up to him, and he with the host himself blesses them. And later people know how to do that, by the way. They can't bless with the host. It has to be a priest or a deacon as well. Now, but it did say towards the end of this letter that there are abuses around, some grave, some less grave, but it does not, this is actually very balanced, usually obstruct the Lord from acting on the soul. In other words, as a good mother, the reaction was, we know it's not right, the thing is going wrong and so on, but the Lord somehow is getting through all this. So it's kind of invitation also to calm down. But it did take note, and we do have the response with a special number and so on. So just be if you're aware of that these things, when you do write, they will write back calmly and ponderantly, and they're on side. And the priests who are abusing are actually doing a lot of damage on ground level, and also by effect, knock on, it goes on to other areas, precisely because no one stops it. So I leave it there, my friends, because when we're in this place of liturgy, we're in the place where God has supremely his rights. And if we take those rights, hijack them, and in some way obstruct God and his wishes, we're the worst enemy of the church in that view. So let's come then to the second part then of Lauds, remembering that we celebrate now the morning prayer of the church, and in